All right, so continuing with the sermon series, Jesus is Greater. My message title for today is going to be Jesus is Greater Than a Hardened Heart. What is a hardened heart? Today, hopefully I can answer that question with some more for you all. I am going to start today with a part of my testimony, a part that I typically avoid sharing at all costs, that God very often makes me share. And you all saw me crying up this weekend, so if I cry again today, bear with me. My sophomore year of college, I was on fire for God. God, up to that point, had just done so much in my life that I could not deny His goodness and His presence and just everything that He had done for me in my life. I was waking up at like 5 a.m. and spending like 3 hours in my Bible, and not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And then I got the news that nobody wants to get, that at 21 years old that I was being diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And in that state of mind and the way my heart was at that moment, my prayer when I initially found out that I had cancer is that God would make me excited to go home. That didn't even make sense. Like, my friends would come to me like, Rachel, like, are you okay? Like, how can I pray for you? Like, we're here for you. And I would just like be really happy. And that's just where I was with God, and it didn't make sense, but it was like one of those like supernatural like peace of God over my life. But I think part of it was also a little ignorance of not really knowing what the next season of my life was going to look like. So I went into that season with this discord in my heart and in my faith, because I am Pentecostal true and true, maybe not the service last night, but I am. And so I believe in a God who heals. I had seen God heal, and I knew that God was choosing in this season to let me walk through it and to not take that away. And so about a month and a half into treatment, I was so hard-hearted. I didn't want to be in church anymore. I didn't want to be around my friends, because anytime I was in people who I would watch in God's presence, it was painful. Because I knew God was good, but I didn't trust that His plan was good for me anymore. And so nine weeks later, I was completely cured of cancer. I was on the road to recovery, and I was miserable. My heart was not what it used to be, and I didn't know how to get it back. And I'm going to leave you all the cliffhanger there and transition into the rest of my message. So I had all of chapter 3, which is 19 verses, and I was going to do a spot of that, and I just couldn't. It all went together so well. So we're going to go really quick, and we're going to cover all 19 verses exegetically today. So if you can turn with me to Hebrews 3, we're going to read 1 through 6 right now. And I want you to count how many times you hear the word faithful in these 6 verses. Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in God's house. Jesus had been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all of God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken of God in the future. But Christ is faithful as the son over God's house, and we are in His house, if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence and to the hope of which we glory. So the word faithful was in that passage a lot of times. And so I did a Greek word study on that, and I also have not taken Greek as the pastor who spoke last week. So the Greek word for that, I believe it's pronounced pistos, I'm not sure. But according to Blue Letter Bible, pistos in the New Testament is defined as one who trusts in God's promises. Everyone repeat the word promises.
Promises.
So we're going to come back to that later. Like, we're going to come back to my story later. All right, now we're going to read Hebrews 3, 7 through 11. So, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as you did in the rebellion, during the time of testing in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested and tried me. Though for 40 years they saw what I did, that is why I was angry with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declare an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. What's happening in this passage? How does it connect with the passage before it? How does it connect with the rest of it? I've read this so many times. It's honestly one of my favorite passages. Like, oh, I love my heart, don't harden it. There's so much historical context that the original Hebrews would have heard that we just don't even know about. So this was a quotation from Psalms 95. Psalms 95 and 96 were an opening call to worship in the tabernacle. So anytime they heard this, they would hear it as a song. And they grew up hearing this song over and over and over again. So to them, it wasn't something new. It wasn't something they just breezed over. It had massive context. And the context of this hardening hearts is actually referring back to Numbers 14. So we're going to Psalms and then all the way back to Numbers. And what is happening in Numbers is the Israelites have left Egypt. They've gone across and they've just sent the spies into the promised land. And the spies have come back. And obviously you know that 2 said, this is amazing, we should go here. And then the rest of them are like, no, there's giants, we can't do this. And at that moment, all of the Israelites hardened their hearts and set up a plan to go back to Egypt. And they were right next to God's promise. One of the commentaries put it this way. The stress falls on the fact that all who had left Egypt had heard God's voice, and all had rebelled, even though they witnessed the redemptive power of God. I was talking with Melissa Archer over my passage, and she said a lot of people find this passage in this context in Hebrew disturbing because the hardened hearts are believers. This is not a passage written to non-believers. Yeah. And so just keep that in mind as we move forward into kind of the tying together pieces. And we're going to read the last little bit we are not in Proverbs, of Hebrews 3:12 through 15. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share Christ, if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the end. Just as it has been said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. And so there's something specific here that really ties all of this together. From me telling you to repeat promise as the definition of faithfulness in the beginning, to hearing his voice and seeing the promised land. When it speaks here and it says the word for sin or for disobedience, it almost, in a lot of the commentaries, it says that it means disbelief. So it's not that you don't have faith. It's not that you don't know God. It's that when you look at his promise, as big as it may be, in light of everything surrounding you, in light of all of these obstacles, all of these giants, that you can't be faithful because the obstacles around you are so overwhelming. Disobedience is not merely a lack of obedience, but rather it is a refusal to obey. So now we're going to go back to the beginning and go back to my hardened heart. So I went for about longer than I should have. Not really going to church, not really being around my friends, not really talking to God. And I will say through all of that, I never stopped hearing God speak to me. There was never a moment where I was laying in bed, sick as could be, with no white blood cell count, that God wasn't whispering over me, I love you, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. And in those moments, I would just get so angry because everything around me, all of my context was telling me that it couldn't be true. that it wasn't true, that God wasn't moving, God wasn't active. And so even after I came out of that season, I still didn't know how to let God back into my heart. So that summer I have a passion for Lakeland. I was leading an SEU mission trip to Lakeland. And so I came back up from Fort Myers. We were on this trip and we had to go to church because I was kind of leading it. So I couldn't just not go to church because I didn't want to be there. So we actually went, I think it was the third intercity that Great City was having. And I specifically went because there were people that I hadn't seen in a long time. I did not go because I wanted to be in God's presence. And as I stood there in worship and I looked around at everybody else raising their hands full of joy in God's presence, I opened my hands and I said, God, I can't do this. I can't hold this anymore. I need you to take this. And I'm not kidding. Instantly, I began to laugh and was so full of God's presence and God's joy. And so I'm going to take you back to verse 13, if you all want to reread that with me. But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. So in my closing today, that Jesus is greater than a hardened heart, we also need each other to remind us of God's goodness in those seasons when all of the obstacles and all of the giants around us are saying that God can't fulfill his promise. So I don't know who in this room today has a promise. I'm pretty sure a lot of you, God has spoken some pretty big things to your heart. And sometimes those things around you look so much bigger and make God's promise impossible, seem impossible. But God's promise is not impossible. The Israelites did make it to the promised land. And God, through Jesus, will bring you all to the promises that he has promised you.
Good.
Amen.